I think that this is part of an overall process. The scientific community is willing, the technology community is willing, but I think that we do need to be thinking about effective ways that science can happen. And it's a slightly lame duck approach if you say, I really think science can help you. I think we actually do need to know what are the problems there, how science and technology can intervene and help. So I'm going to turn, with very little from me now, to Michael Anderson, who has an enormous role. You're the Prime Minister's Special Envoy, Michael, I understand now. So over to you. Thank you.
I am going to say something about the role of science, about which I care passionately, in a few minutes, but I thought I would maybe just introduce a bit about the post-2015 agenda to set the scene, and a little bit about what's at stake. The agenda question arises, as most people here will know, that the Millennium Development Goals were an instrument developed by the United Nations, setting out a series of targets, mainly in health, education, and social dimensions. And they were very powerful tools for focusing attention, mobilizing resources, and bringing some focus and common agreement about what it is we're trying to achieve in international development. They were not complete by any means, but they're widely touted as having had a lot of impact. I think the empirical evidence for their impact is pretty missing, to be honest, and what we miss entirely is a counterfactual. So we need to be honest about that. But the widespread perception among many people who work in development is this really made a difference. Those Millennium Development Goals come to an end in 2015. We won't actually be able to measure what's been achieved until a few years later, but that they come to an end in terms of the organizing framework. And so the question naturally arises, what comes next? I think there are four big things where science can make a big difference. One of them is helping us develop really good proxy indicators for complex change, but proxy indicators that ideally 10-year-olds can understand. So proxy indicators which not only capture big complex change, but also are really good ways to communicate with ordinary people about what's going on. My personal favorite is maternal mortality, which I think is a great proxy indicator for the effectiveness of overall health systems delivery in developing countries. And maternal mortality is something that everyone understands. So it's both a good proxy indicator and it's a great communication device. A second thing is help the policymakers understand causal relationships that are complex. Third, and the one that I'm perhaps most deeply worried about, is how do we help people understand risk? And the last is help policymakers with, this is my fourth, help policy with decision-making tools for taking action in circumstances of uncertainty. And my own view is that we ought to be doing much more relying on Bayesian probability and similar decision support tools to help policymakers get to taking informed decisions even though they're operating in situations of uncertainty.
So I think one of the big questions that we have is how are we going to strengthen that science policy society interface to enable us embrace what comes in 2015 and not wait another 3, 4, 5 years to build those capacities to engage with a new agenda. Start really speaking about the gaps from today. And so I think the first of it comes to the policy making itself. We speak about it right now, what would the world want to see, the world we want in post-2015. But as we speak to policymakers in government, it's how do we even get those sectors to come together and within public policy making, but also within the academic community, the science community, that really in many of our developed countries have sort of been relegated to, can you just review what we've already decided and not an integral part of that policy making. The big issue that we came up with is huge gap data. And how do we respond to that? With whatever we feed over the past 13 years, a lot of that has been survey-based. And in as much as that's been useful, it's insufficient for us to really get to everyone. And when we have an agenda now that says leave no one behind, where are those no ones? How do we get that disaggregated data? Building the scientific capacity, particularly in the South, it's amazing how many institutions we have, but how much investment really goes into them. I can say in my country alone we had over 60 institutes, and none of them funded beyond 10-20% of their needs, and so often just left ticking over and deteriorating and not engaging very much with what was an extremely important agenda. I think when we look to see how loud is the voice of science in the UN system, we certainly have the agencies that respond policy-wise to science, from UNESCO to many departments of others. How effective is that? In Rio, we've come out with certainly one of the 4 dimensions, means of implementation, was for science and technology. Another way of, I think, bringing the voice of science to the whole post-2015 agenda was the Secretary-General's invite to Professor Sachs to look at how would you do this with the science community and academic community. And today, the report of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network came out, and I would be very interested to hear the feedback of you to that.
So I guess the key question for me in terms of science's role is how it can help create a framework where the goals are evidence-based. So some of you may have heard the phrase of evidence-based policy making or policy-based evidence making. I think it's critical that we use this opportunity to ensure that the framework is based on evidence. In terms of the engagement of science so far, and this is really my personal perspective, I think it's been critical in understanding the impact of the current MDGs. So just to give an example that's quite close to the work of my organisation, Sightsavers, what works in health? How have we progressed towards reduction and potential elimination of HIV/AIDS? How are we reducing the impact of malaria in poorer communities and so on? But also I think what's interesting, Michael's right, there's no answer to this, but I do think the scientific community has started asking the question of counterfactuals. So what would have happened if there had been no MDGs? The income poverty target is used as a specific example of this. A lot of that came down to China. Is that because China signed up to the MDGs? Well, no, it's probably not. But I guess my next question is, what's the role going forward for science? And the answer to this is you need to pick your penguin. So are you the penguin on the right? Are you sitting back, nice and comfortable, observing, critiquing, seeing what happens, waiting till the framework's finished, and then saying, oh no, I think you got that wrong, or you could change this bit, or 10 years down the line it's not really going to work? Or are you the penguin on the left? Are you going to dive in and get involved? So I think it's sometimes the case that the scientific community can generate findings and say, well, there you go, off you go and do something with it. And actually for the policy community, that's quite complicated. We don't necessarily have time to then engage in the debate, the to's and fro's, the weaknesses and strengths of methodology and so on. So the risk is, and I've used an example here with the global burden of disease, that you have these seminal pieces of work that are fantastic, they do take knowledge forward, but actually they're more complicated than this, the answers are right, and it finishes at that point.
So we need, the aid business needs to be able to keep different kinds of science and fit them to different kinds of context. And this at the moment I think is really not happening to any sort of proper degree. Then the other point I wanted to get onto is a sort of NGO bugbear. NGOs aren't very good at science, and I'd spent a while trying to work out why people in NGOs don't talk much about science, and why we have a sort of very crude classification of nice science and nasty science, or nice technology and nasty technology. And what it comes down to when you unpick it is that NGOs are very conscious that science is not neutral, and that technology is not neutral, and that with the introduction of new technologies classically has a massive impact on distribution, on who has and who has not, whether it's power, assets, income. Will a new science, this is a picture from Sao Paulo, which we use all over the place to illustrate inequality. Will the introduction of any new scientific breakthrough benefit the people on the left or the people on the right? It's a crucial question. If you're looking for the social acceptance, or if you're trying to achieve the kind of inequality-related MDGs, or whatever comes next, the distributive impact of science is going to be really important. So if science can actually challenge the sort of dumb version of systems, causation that permeates the aid business, that would be hugely useful. And I think this idea about power and neutrality and the wins and losers is going to be a very important part of all the new technologies coming through at the moment.
What a fascinating and brilliant session this has been. My name is Virginia Murray. I'm the Head of Extreme Events and Health Protection at Public Health England, but I also sit on the post-2015 advisory group for disaster risk reduction. And to me, science has been absolutely fundamental, and at our global platform, we have one statement that came out. Organisations increasingly seek systematic evidence-based methods for risk-informed decision-making. What I should love from this particular process that you're discussing is that disasters, which John has focused on in his summing up of your messages, are really one of the great impacts if we fail to get the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainability Development Goals working together. Can we join these up, please? It's a real plea from the heart.
I have a question about environment. So several members of the panel have mentioned the role of the environment in the SDGs, but I've heard it from kind of three different perspectives. One being about environmental change, climate change, so as a pressure or a constraint, as in the planetary boundaries. Secondly, people talking about the environment in its own right, i.e. what's left after everybody's done their development. Or thirdly, the environment as a resource to underpin food, energy, hazard resilience and so on. And I just was curious to hear from the panel how they see the environment in the scientific aspects of the SDGs.
Thank you very much. Louise Shaxson from ODI. The disaggregation of data sets, I think, is absolutely vital. But my worry is that we get terribly excited about disaggregated data just because we can increasingly deal with big data. What about the long-term data sets? You cannot have a counterfactual unless you've got the long-term data sets. Now, what does civil society and policymakers want from science is a different question to what does science really need to have to be able to answer those questions? And I guess that's possibly a question for you in your old role, John.
I run a think tank called Synthesis, which is orientated around complexity science, trying to take complexity theory into the policy world. Michael, you mentioned a few things that seemed very compatible with complexity theory, and Duncan, thank you for mentioning it. It's a really important improvement in science. My question is really to Michael, which is how far have the complexity sciences penetrated into the corridors of policy making, and how far do you think it should penetrate?